They will never be literary translators. If it's a piece of literary writing, then the machine doesn't understand either the fields of meaning around each individual word or the kinds of meaning that we've been talking about that are missing from the page. There's so much that's missing from the page, that's about feelings and other things that machines don't understand. So I mean, I don't think that AI will ever be able to translate literature in any kind of effective way because it doesn't understand human experience.
So, Daisy, you were born into one literary world and have spent much of your intellectual life immersed in another.
Mm-hmm.
What first made India feel less like a subject of curiosity and more like a place from which you could think?
Well, that's kind of a hard question. Um, I mean, my engagement started out through taking a basic Hindi class. And I just felt very drawn to the language, like not in a, you know, subject of curiosity way, but it just felt like something I needed to know. Like felt urgent. Um, and yeah, and then I pretty soon after I was able to go to India and study more Hindi. So learning a language is kind of one of my favorite things to do, and because for me it's not at all about being able to chat with people. It's about kind of accessing different ways of thinking and arranging words and thoughts. And so I love grammar. And I had a lot of trouble actually learning Hindi. Not on the kind of basic grammatical level because the grammar isn't super difficult, but because a lot of it is very oral, like, so if I'm not from the culture, I can't understand the many, many kinds of dialects or like the difference between like Shud Hindi, as it's called, and Urdu and Bollywood Hindi, and like, you know, Hindi spoken in the hills versus the plains. Like none of that is really codified in a Hindi language lesson. So it took me a very long time to kind of get a grasp of the full breadth, but that's, I think, what kept me engaged with Hindi was just always feeling like I didn't know enough. And so I had to keep going and going and going, that there was always a challenge for me. And so then translation and engagement with literature just came along the way, because I went into graduate school and you can't get a PhD just for like learning a language. I mean, I would love like to have gotten a PhD to learn, 5 different languages or something, but they want you to study literature, linguistics, or history or something like that. And of course, I love literature. So the first novel I read was in my first year in graduate school, and my Hindi wasn't super good at that point, but I had to like memorize a lot of vocabulary to be able to get through the book. And that book was by the Hindi author Yash Pal, and it was called Jhuta Sach. Um, and it's about the partition, and to my mind, one of the finest partition novels. And it's very, very gripping in plot, but also extremely accurate and detailed in terms of history and reportage. and he'll have like whole quotations from actual speeches or newspaper articles and things like that because he had a background in journalism. And that novel is in it was translated. It's like 1,000 pages, and it's called This Was Not That Dawn. It's published by Penguin India, so I recommend people take a look at it. So anyway, that just like threw me in the deep end, as they say, and I felt, like I just never looked back. Like that was the right place for me to be, and it's not like I was not from and in any way from this background or anything like that, but you can feel an engagement and a kinship with something that you didn't grow up with, certainly. And I know, like, lots of Indians grow up reading literature about places they have never had any contact with because of colonialism, but it happens less in the other direction, so people find it odd. But really, literature is this gateway into other ways of thinking, and I always try to read translated literature if I don't know the language myself, rather than reading things written in English, because that doesn't give me any challenge.
Yeah, you're talking about how difficult it was to, get a hold on Hindi. The other language is Urdu. I was.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes me think that Hindi and Urdu share histories. They share vocabularies also, and they share memories. Even as politics has taught them to inhabit separate identities. So, does literature still remember a linguistic intimacy that history has tried to forget?
Yeah, well, not just literature, but the language itself. I laugh when I see people, sometimes bigoted kinds of people, either from the Urdu side or the Hindi side, will post lists of words that you should not use because you have to purge your vocabulary of, whichever loan words they think of it as. There are, but it's really funny because I studied a bit of Persian recently, and I had no idea that many of the most basic Hindi words are Persian, like the really basic ones, like bacha. And so, like, nobody's ever gonna purge these words from the language. The language is basic. Essentially, it's the same language, and then artificial factors and like doing things like writing in different scripts have caused divergences, but it's the same language at its heart. And when I'm translating, I translate from both Hindi and Urdu. I try to do it pretty much equally. And I use Hindi and Urdu dictionaries for both languages because there are words that Hindi authors use that are Urdu, and they may not even know it. And they often misspell them, but I have to look them up in an Urdu dictionary, and vice versa. The Urdu writers use Hindi words often without even knowing it, and I have to use the Hindi dictionary to find it.
So let's talk of English now. When a literary culture enters English, something changes beyond language. The scale
Mm-hmm.
and context in which the work is perceived. What does the English speaking world still fail to understand about Indian literatures?
Well, I think a lot of one problem is that there is a lot of Indian literature written in English, and so for many readers in the West, um, that's enough, you know, because it's easier for them to read, and one reason why it's easier to read is because, I mean, easier than reading translations is because it's written for them. Even if the authors say, no, I wasn't writing it for them, if you scratch the surface, they're always writing for a global audience because you're writing English, that people all around the world will read it. And so there's subtle ways in which things are constantly explained So like that people don't get confused about like what is this ritual, what is this food, or like there's an assumption that you've never seen a back alley in Lucknow or something like that, and you have to describe the smells and like the sights and everything. So there's this element of tourism that can creep in. And I know there are some authors that really try to fend that off, and many that write in English and, never leave India. But it creeps in because of the place of English in the world. Whereas when people are writing in Hindi or Urdu or any, pick a language, Tamil or Malayalam, they have a much more constrained view of their audience, and they know that their audience knows what the back alley looks like in Lucknow or whatever. So they don't feel the need to describe every smell that they encounter and stuff like that. So I find that when I'm translating, I want to preserve that. So I'm bringing it into English, which is that global language, which does bring it out into this massive potential readership, because you never know what the reach of a book will be. But I try to preserve it as much as I don't want to alienate the English readers that know nothing at all. I don't want them to feel like I have no idea what's going on here. So I'll do some like inline glosses, like just little things to help them along with a certain word or something like that. But I still try to preserve as much as I can that I think there's a greater intimacy with the setting that you find in literatures that aren't written in English that is really precious, and I want to bring that forward.
Yeah, so in that, a translator has an unusual form of authorship. So you're talking
Hmm.
difference between Indian work which is written in English and the work that is translated is very different. So a translator has an unusual form of authorship. The work bears another person's name, but the sentences bear your decisions. Where
Hmm.
then, for you, uh, does translation end and authorship begin?
Well, I don't. I know there are some translators who say that the translator is a co-author, but I prefer not to say that because um, I'm happy enough to be the translator and let the author be the author. And I think that what I'm doing is trying to recreate, because it's um, we build the whole thing from the ground up, right, in a new language. So I am trying to recreate the feeling that I had when I read it, and trying to give readers that same connection that I felt, or if it's a well known book, that others felt. Um, and so I would say I don't consider myself the author, but translators are commentators. It's not that I don't believe, even no matter how invisible a translator tries to make themselves from the text, you're still seeing their point of view and of this particular work. So we're like commentators, or like another popular metaphor is like to think of the author as a composer of a piece of music, and then the translator is like a musician interpreting it. So you don't say like like if somebody is playing Beethoven or something like that, you don't say that the pianist is a co-composer or something like that. You say like he's a pianist, and Beethoven didn't mean for it only to be played the way that he played. He knew it would be interpreted in all different ways. The source text is his composition.
Okay, you are saying that a translator is a commentator. But a translator can alter the destiny of a writer without altering a single event in their life. Do you think translators fully understand how much literary history passes through their hands?
Oh yes, I think translators are some of the most highly conscious people that there are, because we have to be thinking about so many things at once, because we're thinking about, very basic stuff like grammar and meanings of basic word meanings, but we also have to think about meaning on so many different other levels. And especially for translators into English, we know, and this goes for translating from any language, we know that we are bringing the work to a more global audience, and that if it becomes popular, if it gets picked up, that this will dramatically alter the fate of, if it's a living author, of their kind of their status. And we have, as English translators, the power, I mean, translating into English, the power to, sort of bring somebody into the canon, as it were, of world literature. And I mean, these are all transient things, though. Like, it's English now, English is the big language, but in the past, it's been other languages. It's been French, or it's been Persian, or so like maybe it'll be Chinese. So this is just, for now, this is what it means. What it means to become canonical can often mean that you've been brought into the English language.
Yeah, right. I'll come to your books now. The first one, the one that got recognition worldwide, Krishna Sopti's Gujarat Here, Gujarat There. It became the
Mm-hmm.
first South Asian book to win the Aldo and the Jean Scaglione Prize for
Mm-hmm.
translation of a literary work. What did entering Sopti's world teach you about the limits and the possibilities of carrying a distinctly Indian literary consciousness into English? And how did that experience uh, shape your approach to Tomb of Sand?
Well, I think what that book was very difficult to translate, because her writing, Sobati's writing, can be very elliptical, meaning there's a lot she leaves out, because she wants you to imagine the things between the words. She wants the readers to do the work too. She's not trying to, you know, kind of usher you through the process. She wants you to do the work. And so for a translator, that means you have to think a lot about what she left out, and what is she trying to say, what's between the lines. And often, to reproduce that, you have to do some really difficult things. You have to kind of rebuild the writing. So sometimes you're like not even actually literally translating some of the words, because you decide to put the words that she didn't write, if you know what I mean. And of course, that takes a certain amount of hubris to think I know what she meant here, because it's an interpretation. And but basically, she taught me not to be afraid to do that, to put the unwritten onto my page, but still try to reproduce the oblique kind of wording style. And that, I think, without that experience, I wouldn't have been able to do Tomb of Sand, because Gitanjali Shri is a huge admirer of Krishna Sobati, and she dedicated Tomb of Sand to Sobati as well. And she writes very ambiguously. Like, often, many of her sentences are very ambiguous, and you can't tell, who's doing what to whom, or that kind of thing. Like, she's leaving out as many words as possible, to the point that it can be very confusing. And I think people would be surprised. to know she's leaving out a lot of words since, like, for example, Tomb of Sand is really long. But so I felt like having translated Sobiti, I was able to try to reproduce as best as I could that sense of confusion and ambiguity. Um, so sometimes people who've only read the English say like, "Well, I didn't like this book; it was so confusing." I'm sure the Hindi wasn't as confusing, but actually the Hindi is more confusing than the English because I had to sometimes make things a bit clearer because otherwise, there would be nothing to go on. So yeah, these two books are very much linked in my mind and in my practice.
You're talking of Tomb of Sand a little more. So it approaches partition through eccentricity and humor and gender and the body rather than the
Mm-hmm.
familiar grammar of trauma. What did
Mm-hmm.
that irreverence make possible?
Um, well, I think that I had a friend who told me once he was writing about partition literature, like Manto and things like that, for a master's thesis, and he had the opportunity to interview. This was quite a few years ago. Interview some survivors of violence, and he was, it just like it came up. He just accidentally had this opportunity. There were grandparents of friends and things like that, and he was really excited about it. And he had read all the right books, and he was, ready to hear their trauma narratives and ready to be sensitive. And he said he talked to this one guy's grandfather, and this guy, the way he talked about Partition was like talking about, an amazing like sporting match you once participated in, or something. Like he didn't exhibit any signs of trauma at all because he was very old and he told these stories over and over again. And so it was just like, yeah, and then I clobbered that guy, and that kind of bravado. And but what that made me realize is that, though it's very important to think about trauma and wounds and things like that when we're talking about partition, it's also important to remember the absurdity of it, which is actually something Manto teaches us too, and what Gitanjali gestures towards in that chapter, that begins the third section where all the partition writers are assembled at the Wagah border. And so she makes Toba takes Singh the main character, and that's because, I think because that's a story which, in which Manto is very clearly laughing at the absurdity of the exercise of drawing a line on a piece of paper that appears to be totally arbitrary, which it was in a way. And so even though the outcome was incredibly tragic, there's an absurdity to it. And so I think you have to try to hold space for all of these shades of meaning of partition, and Gitanjali does that very well because she's thinking both about the tragedy but also about the absurdity at the same time. And I think it's, um, to look at something with humor is also to look at it again in a new way, and re-examine, what it means, and what the damage that it's done and stuff like that.
So that makes me think, what happens to a historical wound when a writer refuses to treat it solemnly? Can
Mm-hmm.
humor sometimes reach places that seriousness cannot?
Yes, because I think it draws people in, and so like, um, many of us, to a certain extent, don't want to read something really depressing over and over again, like, so, and we start to turn off our brains. So even if we're making a concerted effort, we're saying to ourselves, I must know this, I must bear witness to this horror. The brain just automatically shuts off at a certain point. So I feel that way, in the current American situation of reading about the things that the immigration officials are doing to immigrants of color. And it's like every day there's horrible testimonials, and there'll be more, and there'll be more, and there'll be more. And so I find my brain shutting down, and I go, I don't want to read another one of these. And then I catch myself and I say, no, you have to bear witness. But you can, like, people, one has these arguments in one's own head. There's so much to pay attention to, and why do I have to pay attention to this again and again and again? So the point being that if you find a different way to portray it, that's which makes the readers let their defenses down, like humor. You just, like, you get drawn in and you're laughing, and this is absurd and this is silly. I think it makes it possible for people to open their minds more, and they'll find that something entered that they may have not wanted to enter, either because they deny that these things happen, or because they don't really want to think about it because it's too upsetting.
I'll talk about the other creative side of yours. You are a painter, and
Mm-hmm.
as much as you are a writer and translator, what does the visual artist in you notice that the writer or translator might miss?
Well, I feel like it's a more direct connection to both my own psyche, but also to human experience. So, for example, like in the scenario that I was just talking about, like where you don't want to think about something. If I make a painting that draws people's attention, and I have done a lot of political art, if I make a painting that draws people's attention to something really horrible that they don't want to think about, um, I can kind of reach them in an instant. Like if you read a book, that takes time and that takes commitment, and getting people to pick up books is hard. But if you make a painting, it could, like, and then I post it on the internet, it will flash across your screen. And if I get it right, if I portray what I want to portray in a way that grabs someone's attention, then that can open their mind in an instant. So there's this, like, very direct connection between an artist and a viewer, that you lack with writing, because it's more laborious for people to read what you've written. Even if they're very excited to do so, they still have to sit themselves down, and in this kind of attention economy, like, block other things out and focus on a book that's a much bigger, like, steeper climb for people.
Yeah, so painting is something that comes from your own mind, and uh, but translating is, being in another person's mind,
Yes.
the author's mind. So after spending so much time inside other writers' sentences, has your own prose become uh, more conscious of its choices? Or do you sometimes long for the unconsciousness of writing before you knew how sentences were made?
Well, I think I can still write in a way that's not ultra conscious. But I have to say, okay, and now I'm going to write my own rating, and then I can. What's the scary thing, I think, is that I can say whatever I want, and so, um, you know, like, people talk about the terror of the blank page, so that when people have writer's block, or if they have to sit down and start writing something, what do they write? And obviously, many of them are not actually staring at a blank literal page, but I usually am, because I like to write with like a pen and paper and notebooks. Um, but the terror of the blank page means like you could do anything or you could do nothing, but there's nothing there until you write it. And so when you're a translator, you never have the terror of the blank page because you know exactly what you have to do. And it might be like a really hard work and a slog and annoying, but you don't have to worry about what's going to happen. So if you're writing creatively for yourself, then you have to confront that. And when you're translating, you have to, be true to the author's voice and meaning and so on. So it's like there's just so many guardrails up. You have so many rules that you have to follow that you might have created them yourself, but you still have rules you have to follow. And when you're writing, it could be anything at all. So that's very scary. Um, and I think the only way in which translation has really affected my creative or just non translation writing is that I am a really good editor. Um, so once I've written something, I can go back and I'm pretty ruthless with myself in ways that I wasn't before I translated a lot. I'd say, oh, but this is a nice sentence. So I just say, how many of these words don't need to be here? And I'll just start cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. It doesn't mean like it's perfect, and other people edit my writing and say you don't need to have this here and things like that. But still, I think it's really pared down my writing a lot.
Yeah, I'll come back to the book now, Tomb of Sand. So the Booker brought Tomb of Sand and by extension Hindi literature into a
Mhm.
different kind of global visibility. What did that recognition make possible, and what did it risk obscuring?
Um, well, I mean, a lot of people, when they talk to me, they assume that now it's become quite easy to um, publish translations of South Asian literature in the West, and that is not the case. Um, because there's a whole system in place um, that is, largely staffed by white people who don't have much experience of the rest of the world or the non European world, let's say. So even publishers of translation who consider themselves very open minded don't really understand or connect with South Asian literature and translation. And so they, following the Booker win, and then there was another Booker win with Heartlamp. So everybody feels like they should be publishing South Asian literature, but to be honest, I think they just don't like it because it's like they don't understand it. And one of my theories is that they're used to, they consider editors and publishers consider themselves arbiters of taste. Like they should be able to say this is a really good book. This book is going to make it and stuff like that. And so they consider aesthetically good translated literature. They're thinking like of Scandinavian or like Japanese literature that are very spare and minimalist kinds of narratives. And generally speaking, South Asian narratives are maximalist, like that there's always a lot going on. And that's reflective of the culture too, that there's always a lot going on. Um, so that has opened some doors, but not as many doors as you would think. Um, and, um, as far as like you said like making some things less possible or like drowning out voices. I mean, I don't think it's really drowning out anything, because we're constantly promoting all the South Asian literatures as much as we can. Like, so I and the other translator and the other authors that won the International Booker, all of us, I think, are always promoting as much as we can, like saying, but there's also Malayalam and there's also Tamil. And so, like, making sure people know that India is just absolutely full of literary traditions. And I think that too is upsetting in a way to these publishers, that there's just not just one world they don't know about, but dozens of worlds, literary worlds that they know nothing about. Because we'll say, well, Malayalam is quite different, or Punjabi is quite different in terms of the literary culture, and that's a little bit daunting and upsetting to them.
Taking that forward, it makes me, I want to ask you that who gets translated is already a form of cultural power. Who gets
Hmm.
celebrated after translation is another. So, where do you think the real gatekeeping happens?
Well, publishing is gatekeeping. And so, um, you know, it can start within the publishing environment of the source text. So, like, there's plenty of people that don't get published in Hindi or Urdu or Punjabi or whatever, because of the gatekeeping that happens there. And then, it's very, very hard to discover books to translate, in the sense that, and I'm talking specifically about India right now, um, that you can't go into like a Hindi bookstore and browse and like discover a book. And the reason is because they're not set up for browsing at all. Like, I remember being just totally stunned. This was a long time ago, but I believe this is still the case. I went into one of the Hindi bookstores in Paharganj, and they I asked about certain books and they would bring them to me. So it's sort of like being in a sari shop or something, and they say, "What do you like? You like green," and then they go get the green ones, right? So, like, what do you like? Do you like Renu? Do you like Premchand? And then they'll start throwing books in front of you. And but I couldn't, even though it was all an open space, it wasn't just behind them like in a sari shop. I could have walked around and looked, but it was set up alphabetically by the first title, or the first letter of the title of the books. So they weren't grouped by author, the books, like they were grouped by title. So you can't, it's almost impossible to browse. And like they're not set out in an attractive way. Like if you go into a nice English bookstore in Delhi, there's all these beautiful displays. Like, this is new, this is just out. If you liked this, you'll like that. They're not at all geared towards finding new readerships or attracting attention, or I think they're like selling, for textbooks and things like that. They're used to just selling by mail order and like for textbooks, so they don't expect like a foot traffic kind of customer. So it's very, very hard to find books, and you have to constantly be asking people, like, what's good, what's new. It's all like gossip. And like you find things on Facebook, and someone says, oh, I heard this person wrote a book. It might be interesting. It's very hard to find reviews of anything. So that gatekeeping is like, it's not the same kind as like actually not allowing people to publish their work, but it's basically a state of kind of, I wouldn't say disorganization, but more just like incomprehension of book marketing. In terms of the casual reader, they're thinking of book marketing in terms because you make more money if you like something gets adopted as a textbook, in an exam or something like that. So then you're going to sell a large number of copies. So that's considered much more important than like getting one or two people off the street to like the book. But then, of course, you understand like say you went in to a bookshop in Delhi and you saw a cool book, you'd never heard about it, but it looks really great. And then like in our modern culture, then you would like take a cute photo of it, next to a cup of chai or something, and you'd post it to your Instagram and say, like, this book looks amazing. And that's what happens. That's the marketing, right? So then then you have a bunch of followers and like say 10 of them say I'm going to go find that book myself or buy it online, and so this word of mouth spreads. But also there you can find people's reviews on Instagram, like, so you might read it and then say this is what I think. So there's this way that information spreads, and that this is not happening with a lot of the Hindi books, for example. So it's very like that makes it very hard for the translators, especially because the translators are more English oriented, so they want to be able to discover books in that way, and instead they have to be constantly hustling people for information. So the gatekeeping is a very complicated process, and some of it is just purely random happenstance, that somebody handed you a book and you turned out you liked it, and then you decided you would translate it. Like it can just be very, very random, and the publishers, English language publishers, are by and large staffed with people who don't read non-English literatures, so they do not go about it systematically. They just wait for the translators to come and pitch stuff to them. They don't say, like, I've heard this is the hot new book, let's find a translator for it, which is actually how it works in the West, that they'll say, oh, there'll be these articles about like the new books in French. And then they'll say, oh, we need to get someone to translate this book. So there's no resource like that at all. So it's very haphazard when it comes to Indian translation. It's all like basically just pure luck and like the eccentric tastes of the translators that dominate the market.
That's quite an interesting observation. There was a point where I worked with a bookstore, but it was a pretty curated bookstore, and I was most of the times, and I was also curating the bookshelves.
Mm-hmm.
But that also made me think about the machines. The future, AI, as we have been
Mm-hmm.
talking about it. It will help in understanding which books can be translated, and it also brought me to this one question, that if machines eventually become extraordinarily good at translating words, might that force us to recognize that translation was never really about words in the first place?
Well, machines already do translate individual words pretty well. I don't think they'll get that much better because they don't, like, you can eat up all the dictionaries they want, but the dictionaries don't contain a lot of information, because like a lot of words have kind of fields of meaning floating around them that are not written down on pages, So I think they're probably as good as they can get at translating words, but no, they will never be literary translators because if each word has a field of meaning and then you put it all together in a piece of literary writing, and I'm talking about not just like writing that like tells you how to assemble your new table or something like that. Um, if it's a piece of literary writing, then the machine doesn't understand either the fields of meaning around each individual word or the kinds of meaning that we've been talking about, like that in Sobati and Gitanjali Shri, that are missing from the page. There's so much that's missing from the page, that's about feelings and other things that machines don't understand. Um, so I mean, I don't think that AI will ever be able to translate literature in any kind of effective way because it doesn't understand human experience.
Okay, just one last question then. Uh, After translating other people's worlds for so long, what has become harder for you to believe about literature? And what, if there's anything, do you believe more deeply now?
Wait, can you say that again? I didn't miss the first part.
Yeah, but no, after translating other people's worlds for so long, what
Mm-hmm.
has become harder for you to believe about literature? And what do you believe more deeply now?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't think anything's become harder for me to believe, but I think I believe more deeply that there's, sometimes an infinite number of ways to interpret a sentence or a piece of literature, and that's what makes it so fascinating.